Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our weekly Torah studies class for the Torah portion of Veschanan. So this morning I saw a tweet by Rashida Tlaib. She is a congressman from the state of Michigan, and she was furious, she was outraged, because from her point of view, from her perspective, the Israeli soldiers attacked Al-Aqsa Mosque on today, which is one of the holiest days of the Islamic calendar. Now, what actually happened? What actually happened is that yesterday was Tisha B'Av, right? Tisha B'Av is the saddest day on the Jewish calendar. It's the day where we commemorate the destruction of the first and the second temple, a day where our Jews felt it's most appropriate to go up to the Temple Mount and to pray. Whether you feel this was the appropriate thing to do or not is not the topic of today's class, but that's what they did. These Jews who went up to the Temple Mount to pray were pelted with rocks and stones by Palestinians, so the police came in to intervene, right? That was what actually took place. Not a surprise that Rashida Tlaib is going to lie so publicly and so offensively and so grossly. But what was so surprising is her anger and frustration that Jews are attacking the Temple Mount on their holy day. Now, obviously, the story is false, but I think we all can remember the year 1973, where not just the Palestinians, but I think 6 Arab countries with tremendous militaries attacked the Jewish people with the goal to wipe them out and to annihilate them on what day? Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, while almost every Jew in Israel was fasting and was observing Yom Kippur and was in shul. There was a sneak attack, there was a surprise attack on the holy day of Yom Kippur. Yet Rashid Tlaib does not comment on that outrage. Now, what was incredibly frustrating and challenging and pretty deadly about the Yom Kippur War in 1973 was that, number one, it was a surprise. Israel was not expecting it. They were not prepared for it. It was devastating to Israel. A tremendous amount of Israeli soldiers died, were killed, were murdered. And the survival of the country was literally at stake. There was a point in the Yom Kippur War in 1973 where they really did not know if we were going to make it. It was bad. Thankfully, through God's kindness and God's miracles, not only did Israel win, right, but Israel actually put quite a devastating blow on many of those Arab armies and got quite close to some of their capital cities. It was quite embarrassing for them. Now, when analyzing what took place in the war, how could it be that the Arab armies had a surprise attack on the state of Israel? We all know that Israel has the greatest intelligence department, not because they're Jews and we're just so proud of them, but because they have to have the greatest intelligence department. It's literally for their survival. How could they have not known that all of these Arab countries were getting ready for war? The answer is they did know. Of course they knew. There was intelligence, there was spies, there was information, they saw the plans, they knew all about it. What was their mistake? Their mistake was they never thought the Arab armies would actually go to war again with Israel. Would they talk about it? Would they discuss it? Would they plan it? Would they maneuver? That, of course, they're going to do. But to actually attack Israel, impossible. Why? Because they were beaten so badly in 1967. They were embarrassed so badly. The conception, the perspective, the attitude of Israeli intelligence, the army, the politicians, there is no way that the Arab armies would actually risk attacking the Jewish people. And because of that attitude, because of that perception, because of the conception that they had, the consequences were dire, the consequences were deadly. And this leads us in the topic of tonight's class, which is foolish misconceptions lead to terrible consequences. And we all have conceptions. Sometimes they're foolish, sometimes they're just false. What do we do? How do we look at the world in the most healthy way? And of course, we're going to apply this to our relationship with Torah. What is Torah? Torah, of course, is of divine origin. Torah is the blueprint for creation. The Torah is what teaches us how to have a moral, ethical, meaningful life. Yet, anyone who has opened up the Torah knows that there are certain sections of the Torah that, from the perspective of a modern person living in the West of the Western world, might make you a little bit uncomfortable. When our sensitivities are in direct opposition to Torah values, how do we come to terms with the parts of Torah that we feel wrong? We go through life with a particular conception, with a particular attitude, with a particular perspective on right and wrong, morality, kindness, holiness, and so on. Those don't necessarily line up with everything that we read in the Torah. How do we deal with that? So let me give you one example. LGBTQ issues. From a surface level perspective, the Torah's approach to LGBTQ issues probably does not line up with what your typical modern Western person thinks. How do you deal with that? How do we react to that? A less controversial subject. The Torah tells us about the Kohanim who have the privilege and have the honor and the great mitzvah of serving in the Beis HaMikdash. And then the Torah tells us that if a Kohen has certain physical deformities, there are certain issues with the person's physical appearances. The person has physical handicaps, they're banned, they're outlawed, they cannot perform this holy mitzvah. How does this work with our conception today, again, of morality, of ethics, of goodness, of kindness? How do we deal with all of this? So, of course, we have to look into this week's Torah portion for some guidance. In this week's Torah portion, the portion of Eschanan, we find the mitzvah, the actual command for us to study Torah. And it's a verse that you are all familiar with because it is in fact in the Shema. The verse is, "And you shall teach them to your sons and speak of them when you sit in your house and when you walk on the way and when you lie down and when you rise up." It is this verse where we find the command and the obligation for two things. We have the obligation to teach Torah, and we have the obligation to study Torah. Now, you might have noticed that the phrasing is a little bit unusual. The Torah doesn't just come out and say, you are commanded, you are obligated, it is obligatory for you to study Torah. That's not how the Torah phrases it. We learn the mitzvah that we are obligated to study Torah from a verse which begins with, "And you shall teach them to your sons." In other words, what's surprising is the Torah doesn't say you should study Torah when you sit in your house, when you walk on the way, when you lie down, when you rise up, and you should teach it to your sons. It begins with teaching Torah to your sons, and then it talks about studying it yourself. Now, the Rambam elaborates on this idea in text number 2a. A father is obligated to teach his son Torah while he is a minor. As the verse states, "And you shall teach them to your sons to speak about them." Just as a person is obligated to teach his son, so too is he obligated to teach his grandson, as the verse commands, "And you shall teach them to your sons and your grandsons." This charge is not confined to one's children and grandchildren alone. Rather, it is a mitzvah for each and every wise man to teach all students, even though they are not his children, as the verse states, "And you shall teach them to your sons." The oral tradition explains, your sons, these are your students. A person who is not instructed by his father is obligated to arrange for his own instruction when he can understand, as the verse states, "And you shall study them and take heed to perform them." So as the Rambam explains these verses, the whole focus, the whole emphasis that surrounds the mitzvah to study Torah is we must teach children Torah, your children, your grandchildren, the children who live in your community. This is the focus of the mitzvah. Why is it phrased this way? You would think that personal study should come first. Once you study, then you can teach. Rather, the whole emphasis is that you should teach Torah to children, and your own personal study, it's almost as if it's an afterthought. Don't you need to study first? The Rebbe asks this exact question. It is puzzling. It would make sense to first state the overall mitzvah to learn Torah, namely personal Torah study, and only thereafter to state that it is not enough to learn on your own, but you must also teach others, starting with your own child. So the question is, each time the mitzvah of studying Torah is mentioned, it's in the context of teaching particularly children, right? Why is that the case? Another question. The Torah particularly singles out teaching young children. Why? The Torah could command the idea that we have to teach Torah. To who? To others, to adults, to people in our community, to everyone we meet. Yet the Torah specifically highlights teaching Torah to children. What is the significance? So we're going to get to the answer right away, and we'll try to unpack it a little bit as well. The reason that the Torah tells us the mitzvah, the obligation that every Jew has to study Torah in a packaging that completely and totally emphasizes that we have to teach Torah to little children, because it's not just telling us that we have to teach Torah to children, but it's actually instructing us and informing us about how we are meant to approach our own personal Torah study, which is we are obligated to approach our study of Torah the same way that a child learns Torah. So the answer is this emphasis on teaching children frames the entire enterprise of Torah study, even when learning as an adult, to approach it as a small child. Now, what does it mean to learn Torah the way a child learns Torah? How do we approach Torah study as a child? So first of all, when you teach Torah to a child, and this really applies to any subject, the child listens. The child absorbs the information. The child is curious. One of the reasons why this is the case is because they don't have any other information to compare it to contrast it with. You tell a child a piece of wisdom, a piece of knowledge, information, a piece of Torah, the child accepts it. The child learns it. It becomes part of who the child is. The child absorbs it. That is the value and the advantage of the approach of a child when it comes to Torah. Their mind is open to listen, to hear, to absorb the Torah. This has to be our attitude as well, right? We have to open ourselves up to the truth of the Torah, to absorb it, to approach it with the same open mind that a child has to the Torah. And there's a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, right, in Ethics from Our Fathers, that highlights this idea. And it says, what is a child who studies Torah compared to? A blank piece of paper. The child studies Torah, that blank piece of paper will become filled with the knowledge, the information that the child studies. What can an adult, an older person, be compared to who studies Torah? It's like a person who's trying to write on paper that has had tons of information written and erased time and time again. It's a lot more difficult to make an impact. It's a lot more difficult to accept because it's bouncing off all of the information that had been accumulated previously. Now, this is a beautiful idea about a child, that what is so precious and valuable about how a child studies Torah, it's like a blank slate, a clean white paper ready for the Torah to be written upon. But it's a little bit insulting to us adults. What are we meant to do? The paper that we have has been written on and erased and written on and erased and written on and erased again and again. How are we meant to approach our Torah study when we're dealing with a paper that's not so receptive to new information? So the Rebbe explains that the Mishnah is not only referring to what is it like when a child learns Torah, it's a blank slate of paper. The Mishnah is trying to tell us that when adults study Torah, how should we approach our study of Torah? The same way as a child does, with that same blank slate of paper. What the Mishnah means when it states, he who learns Torah when a child, is that the person learns with a sense of humility, putting himself aside and approaching it as a child. Studying with such an approach is really the only way for the Torah to be truly absorbed, as an ink on fresh parchment. By contrast, when one's approach to Torah study is based on the sum total of their own intellect and rationale, as a senior, without any humility, he cannot absorb the Torah, which is God's Torah after all. When a person studies Torah, their mind has to be open. It cannot be like a skeptic. It cannot be like a person who has previously formed opinions, perceptions, and conceptions. It's not going to work. You have to erase all of your preconceived notions, and you have to be humble and open yourself to learning what it is that the Torah has to say. The Torah, again, divine wisdom, divine truth, the blueprint for creation, and the source for all morality and ethics. I'm going to give you an example. So last week, I was in Seattle. When I was in Seattle, I was asked to give a lecture. When I was about to begin the lecture, I said to the crowd that I'm doing things a little bit differently, right? There's one way to approach a lecture is you are going to hear what I want to talk about. So that's not what I want to do tonight. I want to talk about what you want to hear. So tell me, what is on your minds? What would you like to hear? A few different ideas were mentioned, and one that was repeated a few times was an issue that I mentioned at the beginning of the class. How do you deal with LGBTQ issues? A person who grows up, a person who lives in America, 2021, right? You are told that LGBTQ issues are healthy, are beautiful, are wonderful, and et cetera, and et cetera. A person should take great pride in all of these issues. And thinking about it and growing up in that environment, it's very easy to think that this makes sense and that in fact it is logical and it is moral and it is ethical and it's all good and wonderful. And if you want to think about it from a religious or Torah perspective, you might squirm and you might be uncomfortable, and it's going to be hard to square these two issues, these two approaches. So they want to know, how does a Torah observant Jew wrap their head around these two issues, around these issues? So I answered them by exactly what we have been discussing here. I said the only way that we could appreciate any of this information, we have to erase from our mind any and all preconceived notions about everything. Not just about marriage, not just about relationships, not just about intimacy, not just about LGBTQ, not just male and feminine, male and female, not just people, but the world itself. We have to go back to square one. You cannot come to this conversation with the conception and the perspective and the attitude that you have currently today about what relationships and intimacy and marriage is all about. It's not going to work. We have to approach the subject like a child. Ink on fresh parchment. Said, let's go all the way back to the beginning, before there is even a world period. Recognizing that first there's a world, right? Why was the world created? What is the purpose that we exist? What is the purpose of a man? Why did God create a woman? What is the purpose of intimacy? What is the purpose of relationships, right? And we spent a lot of time talking about it. Then that's not the topic for tonight. Perhaps on another night we can speak about it, but they really got the point. It's not that everyone walked away totally happy, right? It's still something that we have to struggle with. But when they recognize that we have to reframe the entire discussion, we have to remove our preconceived notions, we have to open ourselves up to see what does the Torah really have to say about this issue. And we go to square one again. What is the purpose of creation? What is a man? What is a woman? Why are they here? What is the purpose of intimacy? What takes place with intimacy? What is the reason for it? What's the purpose behind it? What do we accomplish? What's marriage all about? Study, learn, appreciate all these things from a Torah perspective, and your entire view of intimacy and relationships is changed, is altered, it's going to be different. You're going to be looking at the world through different lenses. All right, let's go to text number 8, which is a beautiful text from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, where he describes what is the healthy way that a person should ask questions when they're bothered, when they're frustrated with an idea within Judaism that doesn't seem to line up with how they view, the rest of the world views it. Okay. There are conditions, though, for asking a Jewish question. The first is that we seek genuinely to learn, not to doubt, ridicule, dismiss, reject. That is what the wicked son of the Haggadah does. Asks not out of a desire to understand, but as a prelude to walking away. Second is that we accept limits to our understanding. Not everything is intelligible at any given moment. There were scientists at the beginning of the 20th century who believed that virtually every major discovery had already been made, not suspecting that the next 100 years would give rise to Einstein's relativity theory, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, Gödel's theorem, proof of the Big Bang, origin of the universe, the discovery of DNA, and the decoding of the human genome. In relation to Torah, there were many German and American Jews in the 19th century who could not understand Jewish prayers for a return to Zion and deleted them from their prayer book. These facts should induce us in a certain humility. Not every scientific orthodoxy survives the test of time. Not everything in Judaism that we do not understand is unintelligible. The very features of Jewish life one generation finds difficult, the next generation may find the most meaningful of all. Faith is not opposed to questions, but it is opposed to the shallow certainty that we understand, that what we understand is all there is. So now it's crystal clear. Now it makes total sense. Why does the Torah present to us the obligation to study Torah in the context and from the launching pad of teaching Torah to children? Is because this is the attitude, this is the perspective that we must have, we must approach when it comes to studying Torah. No preconceived notions, open to receive the will of God, the wisdom of God in the Torah. We're open to absorb and open to connect. In the Rebbe's words, text number 9, the fact that Torah education begins with even small children underscores the idea that the premise and foundation of all Torah study is not so much its intellectual wonder, rather it is about remaining humble and small, submitting to its author who transcends all logic. This notion of humility is not specific to the mature adult, rather it is the domain of everyone, even by dint of their soul, a small baby who has just started speaking. The fact that the instruction to an adult to study Torah is recorded only as part of the instruction to teach the children teaches us that even when a person is engaged in a rigorous, intellectually stimulating Torah study as a mature adult, they must still retain that humility, that wonderment of a child. This sense of childlike wonder helps the Torah student accept God and his Torah as truth, and not carry over their own sensibilities into the picture. Now, how do we do this? Because as I mentioned before, we are growing up in the year 2021, in the modern world, in the Western world, which does give us a lot of preconceived notions, which may appear to conflict with ideas of the Torah. And yes, we gave an approach, we gave a perspective of how to approach these issues, but still a person may find it challenging. How do we come to terms with the idea of removing preconceived notions? The key is to reframe what knowledge really is. Is something that we view as a fact today, is it really a fact? Will it be a fact tomorrow? Historically speaking, there are many things that were viewed and termed and deemed to be absolutely fact, which turned out not to be the case. Now, I want to give you a few examples. You may be familiar with them, but they might help you in wrapping your head around this idea that we should not be caught up with what we know now and think now to be as absolutely correct and factual and moral and ethical and correct and right. So let's give a few examples. The president of IBM once said, I'm not sure the year, but he once said, I think there is a world market for maybe 5 computers and 5,000 copy machines. They could not comprehend what computers really are, the value what computers could actually bring to the world. Right? This is the head of IBM. Who could need a computer? Who could want a computer? Impossible. An associate of commercial radio and television pioneer, David Sarnoff, stated, the wireless music box has no imaginable commercial value. Who would pay for a message sent to no one in particular? Could a person have been more wrong? Astronomer and mathematician Simon Newcomb said, flight by machines heavier than air is impractical and insignificant, if not utterly impossible. We're talking a person who is a professor, astronomer, mathematician. We're not talking about an idiot on the street. He said, flight is impossible. We can't do it. He says, it's not possible. And of course, we know what happened afterwards. Television won't last because people will soon get tired of staring at a plywood box every night, said Daryl Zanuck, movie producer for 20th Century Fox. How did that prediction stand the test of time? Have people gotten bored of staring at screens? Doesn't seem to be the case. Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize winning economist, stated, by 2005 or so, it will become clear that the internet's impact on the economy will be no greater than the fax machines. Paul Krugman, this is not a fool, this is not an idiot. This is a person who understands the economy, Nobel Prize winner. And he wrote, the internet will have no effect, practically no effect on business, on the economy. All of the people who made these statements were experts. They knew what they were talking about. These people were smart. They were working with all of the facts as they were known at that time. It was based on knowledge, rationale, logic. They were at the forefront. They were very current. They were very modern, yet they were absolutely and unbelievably wrong. We are all fallible. We don't know everything. We may proclaim things with absolute certainty and confidence that they represent and they express the height, the peak, the pinnacle of morality and ethics, but they in fact may not be the case at all. And therefore we have no reason to be uncomfortable, to hide or to shy away from any element of the Torah. We have the faith, we have the trust, we have the confidence that even if we do not yet understand today how it is the greatest morality and the greatest ethics, we know because we approach Torah as a child, without the biases, without the preconceived notions. We recognize that we are receiving divine wisdom, divine knowledge, and therefore we recognize that the Torah is not just progressive, it's the most progressive, even if we're not able to appreciate it at this moment. And God willing, the more we learn, the more we will understand and appreciate the morality, the ethics, the brilliance, the beauty, the holiness, the spirituality of the Torah. So when we learn Torah, we need to discard our assumptions. We need to accept that there's more we do not understand. As smart and progressive as we are simply not yet comprehending the incredible progressiveness of the Torah. Thank you so much for joining us for another Torah studies class. Have a fabulous week. I look forward to seeing you next week.